Thank you so much, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Let's Talk Policy, which is a series that we started here at the Kautilya School of Public Policy, where we look at important issues, policy or issues, obviously, every week, and try to talk to industry leaders, experts, leaders, thought leaders in those particular fields about what constructive solutions we can offer. And one of the things we're going to talk about today, which is really important, is how the pandemic has affected education. Now, the pandemic has, over the last year and a half, changed all our lives fundamentally in so many different ways. And one of the sectors which has been the hardest hit has been education. So whether it's little kids, who used to go to school, or university students who've had their futures literally change and not expected this to last this long. That's the other thing. I think a lot of us thought that this pandemic would last a few months. We would probably have to make adjustments for one academic year. And now we're looking at possibly two, maybe even three academic calendars being affected by this, if not longer. So what are the lessons we've learned from the pandemic about how this has affected education, and what, could the road ahead possibly be? Is this an opportunity also for bigger reform as far as education is concerned? So let me introduce our terrific panel this evening. We have Shaheen Mistri, who is the CEO of Teach for India. She's a social activist and educator. She's founded the Akanksha Foundation, an Indian non-profit educational initiative. Teach for India aims to provide an education to all children across India by building a pipeline of leaders committed to ending education inequities. So it's wonderful to have Shaheen Mistri with us. Yamini Aiyar, the President and Chief Executive of the Center for Policy Research, which is a public policy research think tank. She's been a senior research fellow and founder of the Accountability Initiative, which is credited with pioneering one of India's most extensive expenditure tracking surveys for elementary education. That's something Yamini Aiyar herself was very closely involved in. And then we have Prateek, who is my colleague here at Kautilya. He's the co-founder of the Kautilya School of Public Policy, also the project director for the Ekatrit at Educate Girls, and therefore has been working very closely as far as initiatives on educating girls is concerned. He'd also worked with Shaheen Mistri at Teach for India earlier, and has also studied at the Harvard Kennedy School. Now he's come back and wants to do something here in India. So great to have all of you. We'll be joined shortly by the Aam Aadmi Party's spokesperson at MLA, Raghav Chadha. And the reason he's coming on today is because as far as government school education is concerned, the Delhi government has consistently scored high on various indices, including those released by the central government. So we're going to talk to him to try and understand what is it about the Delhi model that's working, and whether that is something that can work in other parts of the country as well. So let me get straight into this. Shaheen Mistri, to you first. What's the last year and a half been like? I mean, what are the biggest takeaways from you about how education has been impacted by this pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, Nidhi, I feel so heartened that we're having this conversation, because it seems like, it just seems ludicrous to me that we're spending time thinking about when to open bars and parks, and we're not actively dialoguing and debating on how to reopen schools as quickly and as safely as possible. So I think I very much appreciate this space. I've been myself spending the last couple of weeks just immersing myself in the, I don't know how to say it more than like a catastrophe has already happened with children. And I think it is growing with every day that we don't jump in and solve it. And not for lack of very, very laudable efforts from so many. I think all of us love and care for our children. And over the past 15 months of the pandemic, we've tried everything. We've tried remote learning. We've tried to help our kids with anxiety. We've tried to figure out how to provide rations. Like so many of us across the country have tried. On aggregate, it just hasn't worked. And I think the numbers and the statistics are absolutely frightening. From UNESCO's estimate that, every month out of school is equivalent to 2 months of learning loss. We're talking about 30 months and growing for Indian children. If you're in grade 3, the estimate is that it's going to be 2030 before you catch up. And so the repercussions are dramatic. We can go a little bit more into them later, but I think they span social, emotional, and educational, and we need to look at the holistic needs of the kids. But this is a generation in crisis, and I think it's an invisible, interestingly, crisis. I think people are not seeing the medium and long-term impact on our children in the way that we need to be looking at this.
Okay, so I do want to ask you about those repercussions in some detail. I just want opening comments from everyone first. So, Yamini, Aiyar, your opening thoughts on this. Would you agree with Shaheen Mistri's assessment of things? It really sounds pretty bad. And obviously, we're going to see the impact of what has happened for the foreseeable future, aren't we?
Absolutely. I completely agree with Shaheen and wanted to echo both her thanks that we are having this conversation. We simply are not talking about this enough. And as she rightly says, a fair amount of time has been spent trying to figure out how to open bars and restaurants and other services. For some reason in Delhi, we still choose to keep parks shut. When Raghav comes, we must ask him that, because that's important for children too, by the way. But we haven't as a society pursued the question of what it will take to open schools. And when I look at many other countries, because after all, the lockdown was not unique to India, in fact, schools were the last to shut. And every effort has been made to ensure that schools in some way or form can continue even when second and third waves have come. So it says a lot about whose voices are heard in policy and whose voices our politicians respond to when just by looking at the extent to which schools have been completely invisible from the debate on impact of COVID. I think there are three important things for us to consider here. One, there is absolutely no doubt that schools being closed for a long stretch of time means that we are going to have a significant amount of learning loss. I myself am a parent of two small children who go to primary school, and I'm seeing the extent to which the absence of long stretches of learning is now beginning to affect them. And let's not forget that India is going to experience this learning loss against the backdrop of an education system that mostly has had difficulty in ensuring that children who complete even 5 years of schooling have basic foundational learning. So, if 50% of children in standard 5 can barely read a standard 2 text, having gone through at least some proportion of the school year inside classrooms, now think about what that means when you've closed schools for a long stretch of time. My colleague at CPR, Jishnu Das, looked at the impact of school closures for primary school students for 8 weeks during the Pakistan earthquake back in the early 2000s. And he found that, in fact, the ability of those students to catch up through their school life was far lower than those who didn't miss out on large stretches or even of those 8 weeks of school. So losing out from school has a huge impact. We assume that a lot of that impact can be bridged with digital learning. I'm sure we'll talk about that going forward, but there are questions of what digital learning can do, especially at the younger primary level. There's also issues of digital inequality, which I'm sure we'll discuss. There's two other aspects. One, the economic crisis that COVID has meant that a large proportion of children that were perhaps in primary school, in private schools, are now most likely going to be out of school and may come into the government system, which is so technically free. What is the impact of that going to be on the ability of the education system to respond as more students come into the classrooms? It's both an opportunity as well as a challenge. The third is that as of now, if you look at employment data, you will find that women have actually been very hard hit as a consequence of unemployment caused due to lockdowns. There are many reasons why women have not been able to make their way back into the workforce, but the fact that schools have been closed is one of them. So just to say that the closure of schools is impacting is telling us a lot about what kind of society we are and what we choose to prioritize. It's also presenting to us a very, very important challenge when it comes to how do we deal with this learning loss and digital inequalities. And third, it has ongoing economic consequences, and the economic consequences themselves are going to impact schools. So when we open, schools are going to look very different, and we'll have to think very hard about how we can address gaps. Again, opportunities and challenges there.
Okay, well, Prateek, your opening comments, and I wanted to ask you in particular about the impact on higher education. Both Shaheen Mistri and Yamini Aiyar have spoken about the closure of schools and how this has impacted children. But obviously, we've seen it across the board, whatever the age of students may be. So what are the challenges you're finding in higher education in particular?
Okay. While I would love to talk about girls' education later on in the piece, but let me pick about the higher education piece here as well. Look at higher education as an impact where people are not even sure whether they will get 12th marks in time to get into undergrad, right? So there is a board exam. We are all used to the system. State boards do the exam. CBSE does, ICSE does, and then there is an application process which happens to the university, right? Right now there is no clarity on what the process is going to be, right? In terms of masters, people are not sure whether to invest in masters, whether to leave their jobs at this point and invest in a masters, whether they're not even sure whether the online classes will be there or physical classes will be there. We at Kautilya are thinking of starting in a bio bubble in time, because our learning infrastructure was prepared during the pandemic, so we were sort of cushioned by the impact. But obviously, starting in a bio bubble, we've seen ticket matches happening, right, in bio bubble. Imagine how difficult it is for them to do that. To do that at scale for education, higher education, is not possible. Are our universities geared up to safely start in terms of health and nutrition, etc.? No, right? So our infrastructure itself is not geared up, right? Only the new colleges which are born within the pandemic can sort of take a leap. Students can take a leap of faith and join. But what happens? How do you sort of first get the students to give the exam? There's going to be so much issue in terms of parity, right? Some boards are going to give results which are going to be in favor of students. Some schools will push their students to sort of score well based on the internal exams, because they want their brand name to be out there. So the gaps between the have and the have-nots is going to increase, right? Poor will be pushed further down the marginalized thing, because imagine the great leveler was a board exam, right? You could prepare, get the board exam, based on your merit, get the admission, right? But now the system clarity is not there on what is it, that how are you going to be graded, right? And parents are worried, right? Forget about students, because parents in India are closely monitoring where their child is going to be, right? And they are not sure. When I talk to parents, they're like, okay, what if my child doesn't score well in the arbitrary formula which they're trying to devise, based on 30 30 30 10th 12th and the internal sort of scoring, right? And that sort of probably will if have a long term effect on where the child goes eventually, right? Could be that the child was supposed to go to a top tier college, but based on that, maybe they have to take a gap year now, because they might have to go to a college of either not their choice, or wait another year and give the board exams when the times are right. So absolute pandemonium when it comes to higher education. There is no clarity on how to sort of start the universities in time, and what will be the mechanism to actually ensure that merit is taken into account, right?
Okay.
So those are my
So,
opinions.
so there are a series of issues here. So let's try and break this down one by one. And Shaheen, Mistri, let's come first to the issue of in the whole inequity that we see. Firstly, the fact that kids are learning online. For what it's worth, those who do have access to the internet and to a tablet or a laptop or whatever, how is that affecting the quality of the education that they're getting in that format? B, the fact is, so many kids don't have access to that. That's the reality of our country. It's the reality of many kids in the West also. So just take us through how those inequities have actually only further deepened in the last year and a half or so.
Yeah, Nidhi, as someone who has two daughters at home, and then 38,000 odd children at Teach for India, I don't think I've ever seen the inequity in as stark a way as this year. Because while of course the pandemic has impacted all of our children, my kids migrated pretty much overnight to online learning, and as you said, barely 42 odd percent of kids even have access. Like forget learning, just we're talking about access, right? So there's as you said a huge challenge with access, but I think there are other significant challenges that that are slightly more invisible, and a big one is instructional time, right? So even when kids did have access, on average, teachers were teaching for an hour a day, right? Great schools around the world are teaching for 7 to 8 hours of instructional time a day. So you're talking about an hour of instructional time in a home setting which is distracting. And so instructional time, I think, is a huge issue. Engagement is another huge issue. I think, one of my big nightmares when this whole thing hit was, oh gosh, I hope what doesn't happen is teachers take what was usually already quite a boring class and now stand in front of a video and record it. And I think that's what happened, because teachers don't know how to teach online, right? It's a new form of teaching. It requires an investment in teachers themselves and upskilling of teachers. So I think that was a huge issue. I also think while we saw beautiful examples of parental involvement, and many of us, myself included, are saying, wait a minute, how did we not understand how important parents are in the process of education before the pandemic? We also saw issues with that, right? School is also, along with being the place where kids get content, it's also daycare for many parents. It allows them to go out and have their own lives. So suddenly parents were at home, stress levels were higher, anxiety was higher, isolation was there. And kids really struggled with all of that. So we at Teach for India, we've been sort of looking at 4 dimensions of learning over this year. We've looked at attendance, and even with really, really passionate teachers, right? Our Teach for India teachers are making calls every minute to families, going into communities, delivering packages. Even with that level of dedication, we've had about 60% of attendance, right? We've seen kids migrate. The second dimension we looked at is engagement. Of the 60% attending, keeping kids engaged has been a massive challenge. Then we looked at mastery. The mastery of content has been much, much lower, right? So at every level, you're losing out on attendance, then engagement, then mastery, and finally well-being, right? For kids, school was such a space to come and be a child and connect and socialize and get physical activity. So we're seeing all of that play out as well.
Excellent points, and I want to also talk about this issue of the sort of impact it's had on children in a more psychological way as well. In just a moment, I do want to ask you about that. And Yamini, I also was talking about the fact that women in the workforce, women have been impacted because they've had to stay home and be with the kids, and it's just had a domino effect on everything else. The question though, Yamini, Aiyar, is when we talk about reopening schools. Now, how do we do that? Do you think there is a way to do it safely? I did notice, for instance, in the UK, that they've kept schools open even during the peak of the pandemic, and a lot of parents were okay with that. Others were not. It was highly controversial. But in the absence of vaccines and all this worry about whether a third wave is going to hit children harder, etc., nobody really knows what's going on. Is there a safe way, you think, that schools can open? Your mic.
Of course there is. Where there's a will, there's a way. I think that the one advantage that most schools in India have, except for perhaps the very, very thin sliver of extremely elite schools that are fully air conditioned, is that they're not air conditioned. And we also know that ventilation is really helpful. So stick on your fan, stick a cooler in if you can afford it, put it on, you get ventilation, open all the windows, reduce the number of children in the classroom, do it in slots through the day. All of this is entirely possible and feasible. And for large parts of India, particularly in rural areas, which is where I think I've never fully understood why schools have been shut. For all of us who have worked on education and have been to rural schools, we know that very often the classes are taking place outside of the building. So it's all khulla. It's all in the open. There's even budget line items, because when we used to do the expenditure tracking surveys, we found schools that were quote unquote buildingless because they hadn't yet got grants to make buildings. Why does that school need to be closed? So yes, it's entirely possible, but there's a challenge there as well, that the government school teacher in particular is the key frontline official that is spread across the country. And these teachers have not actually been sitting idle all of this last year and a half. While they've also been involved in digital online teaching to the extent possible, they've also been very actively involved in COVID-related activities. We've had to deploy our frontline for various things, which does make it harder. And it also therefore reduces the incentive for government to think actively about what is needed to open the schools. I want to just say two other things. It's very important, I think, and Shaheen made this point about the nature of pedagogy inside classrooms. We've been doing a lot of structured classroom observations, and the average classroom is very much designed to read out of the textbook, ask a few questions, use the blackboard. The rote learning structure within which the classroom is locked in the Indian system and in many other systems across the world is very predominant in our schools. And in fact, the transition to digital could have been an opportunity, and in some cases it has been deployed as an opportunity to try and rethink pedagogy in ways that are able to teach children in a much more engaged way. Now, this requires a lot of rethinking of teacher training and reworking of all of that material. Some governments have done it, but many haven't. And when schools open, this is going to be the key. We know that children are going to come back to the classroom. We'll talk about the mental health issues later, I'm sure, but they're going to come back to the classroom having lost a significant amount of quote unquote learning. This is already in the context where a single classroom, take a standard 8 classroom, you'll find kids there at standard 2 level, at standard 4 level, at standard 8 level. So the curriculum is always far ahead of most of the kids, except for the first few rows of the classroom. And Pratham and many other institutions have been experimenting with different ways of trying to reorient pedagogy to where children are. So the teaching at the right level work that Pratham has been doing is a good example of this. And I think that it's important for us to start thinking about how does one reshape, reframe, rework the curriculum, think differently about assessments, and prepare teachers from now so that when finally schools will open, we can actually address many of the long-standing challenges to the education system and ensure that children genuinely catch up and are able to make up for all those years of not being in classes.
Well, we got lots of questions already from those who tuned in. And before I go to that, I'd like to welcome Raghav Chadha and thank him for joining us. I know he's busy in Punjab at the moment and he's taken time out to join us. And Raghav, it is remarkable that in the middle of this pandemic, the Delhi government's performance as far as Delhi government schools is concerned has been pretty good. The Niti Aayog's indices that came out in January again placed Delhi government schools in the top rank of UTs and so on. But a question that Yamini Aiyar had raised just before you joined was, why is it that schools and reopening of schools is not a priority yet? We've opened malls, reopened malls and restaurants and so on. But she believes that there is a way that it can be done safely. There is good ventilation in schools, etc. Would you like to sort of answer that on whether this is possible in the near future?
Look, I do agree with some of the points that Yamini made, that yes, this should be a priority, and for a government, the Aadmi Party in
Okay, I think we're slightly struggling with your internet connection, Raghav. And this is what is happening with you joining us on a webinar. So I can imagine what's happening to kids who have to.
Can you hear me now?
Let's try
I'm in hinterland Punjab.
Yeah, I know.
Yes.
Okay,
probably when we form the government, we will improve the network connectivity next year. Now, as far as the digital divide, as well. So, for example, as far as Yamini's question is concerned, yes, I do agree with some of the points that she's made. But as a government, as a political party in government in the national capital that is credited with bringing in so many reforms in the education sector, for us, education is most certainly a priority. But at the same time, we also do look into and have to look into and cannot certainly ignore the health aspect. The last year has been a pandemic year, and it's been extremely challenging, not only for the students and the children, but also for kids, also for teachers as well as their parents. And therefore, the single biggest focus of our government is going to be when school reopens is to reconnect with the students. When I say reconnect, I mean work on their social well-being, bridge the gap, because for the last 12 months, these people all students, all parents, all teachers have been traumatized, and therefore bridging that gap, strengthening the foundation is going to be one of the critical aspects of our government. We are very keen, and we certainly hope that once situation improves, we would be in a position to open schools. But at this point in time, Delhi has just recovered from the second wave of the worst crises ever seen by mankind. Now, in the last 1 year, when the schools in Delhi and across the country were shut, our government was able to reach out to students using several technological interventions. And when I said technological interventions, these were not merely for kids or for families that had access to iPads and tablets, but also to those who did not have computers or did not have access to tablets and iPads, but had a smartphone. And even those who did not have smartphones, our teachers called up the parents on the landline that they had at their house, and imparted information, knowledge, etc. So roughly 95% of the students that go to Delhi government run schools had access to either a smartphone, a tablet, or a computer. Remaining 5%, we reached out to them using our telephones, landlines, and tried to bridge the gap. That is point number one. Point number two, what the Honorable Deputy Chief Minister of Delhi, also holds the education portfolio, did last year was he has allocated some money and has started building of a virtual Delhi model school. Now, this will not be an online classroom alone. It will actually be a virtual school. And by the end of this academic year, the Delhi virtual model school will become a reality, whereby we are also, leveraging technology in a way to ensure that even if this pandemic, were to stick around for a while, the education of children should not certainly suffer. While I say that, the government has time and again highlighted the mental health aspect of both the teachers as well as the students, and that is something that is going to be, a very significant, consideration for our government when we plan, whether the reopening of the school or the continuation of the existing model of imparting education.
All right, and I hope that schools can open sooner rather than later. I do understand your dilemma. Also, I think parents, Yamini, unfortunately, will also be really scared at the moment. We saw that in the way the whole pressure was mounted on the board exam issue, because people are just freaked out, and I don't blame them. I mean, it is what we all went through. I'd like to take questions from those who joined us, and Rawson Gonzalez, if you're here, you can please tell us who you want to direct your question to and ask it. Go ahead.
Yeah, hello. Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. So my question is for anyone actually, but my question is, will strengthening the online education system bring about equity in the education, especially in the current COVID times and even post-COVID times? Just because we know the large chunk of a population, around 10%, if I were to say, of households have computers, and 25% of them have internet facilities, and the rest really don't. So will strengthening the online education really help us?
Prateek, do you want to take that? Is it possible to strengthen?
I mean, in the long run, obviously, any government, state or central, would be interested in internet penetration, as well as increasing the access to computers and mobile phones. But let's look at it in the short run. I know Teach for India, Shaheen can answer that question better. I know Teach for India is going out and getting tablets for their students, so that at least they could, whatever donations come in, the students could get access to those. But let's look at the scale. Let's look at the problem. Maybe in the cities, the pace of getting the access to digital could be quicker, but large chunk of Indian population lives in rural areas where, forget about a computer, a school having a computer in itself is a big deal for the administrator to work on it, right? I know of schools wherein block development officers actually have to go to the district to actually upload a lot of the data which the state requires, right? So it's easier said than done. It's not a short-term solution. Obviously, in the long run, pandemic or no pandemic, state governments and central government has to invest in the infrastructure, but digital learning cannot overnight happen. We were not geared up for such a scale when the pandemic struck. But I'll let Shaheen share her experience of how she's been able to cope up with it.
Sure, Shaheen.
Thanks. Thanks, Prateek and Nidhi. And Nidhi, I'm just going to go backwards a little bit and just add a little bit to the last point as well. I think you asked a great question. Can we reopen schools safely? And I think Raghav and all of us are so concerned about the health of our kids. The reality is that India is one of the 10% of countries in the world today that have not reopened schools. So the first point is there are lots and lots of examples. 65% of countries have fully reopened, the rest have partially reopened. There are also detailed guidelines from the from health advisors and experts on how to reopen. Those guidelines include when we should reopen and linking that to infection and transmission rates on the ground. They include what schools should do to make sure when kids come back that they are safe. And so I think for us not to be spending time actually articulating and communicating that we will open schools if 1, 2, 3 is in place is extremely dangerous and damaging, because to prepare our schools to reopen safely is going to be a journey of its own. So just want to make a strong point around, like we said, level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we're going to link the opening of bars, parks, etc. to this. I think we need to link schools to this. That's point number one. Point number two is we don't need to reopen in the way that schools were opened before. So a lot of advisory is coming and saying, reopen partially. In fact, reopen even at 25% attendance, but one touch point at minimum a week that's physical for a child can make a world of difference, and for a teacher can make a world of difference. So I just wanted to add that to the first part. To the second part on online learning, I believe that there is a huge silver lining that has come out of the pandemic. And I call that blended learning, right? What we call hybrid learning or blended learning. I think we need to understand, and what we've seen in the last year is that learning can happen in a physical classroom and should, and there are some things that are best done in physical classrooms. Learning can actually happen online and through technology, and there are some things that are much better done using technology, and learning can also happen beyond the classroom, right? One of my kids in the middle of the year stood up and said, Didi, isn't it strange that just because the 4 walls of a classroom are inaccessible, learning stops? And it was a real aha moment for me. It's a physical building, and yet learning stops, right? So I think we need to embrace blended learning. We need to ask ourselves what form of learning is best done where, and then we need political will to give our children access, to put in the tremendous work needed to reorient teachers and the system. But if we do that and we do it thoughtfully and not jump into it, I think it can truly be an equalizer for all children.
In fact, Raghav, Chadha, I just want to ask you about that, because Yamini Aiyar also raised this point earlier, which was about this being an opportunity to re-look at curriculum, to re-look at the way we're training teachers, and that this may be a chance to actually bring about a bigger change. Is there a plan to do that?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. There is a plan, and the plan was articulated very well by the Deputy Chief Minister of Delhi when he had tabled the budget for the financial year 2021-2022, and where he discussed the the institution and the concept of a virtual school, as well as how the the whole the way that we look at the curriculum needs to change, and how we need to inculcate several other things in order to ensure an all-round development of the children. Now, as far as reopening of the schools is concerned, just like every other panelist on this panel wants the schools to reopen, so do I, and so do my political executive in the government. But and it is also a fact that India is perhaps one of the only few countries where schools have not yet opened, and several parts of the country, several parts of the world have opened education institutions. But it is also true that India is one of the worst hit nations as far as this pandemic is concerned. Right after the Prime Minister was tom-tomming about how India as a country has conquered the COVID-19 virus, we saw the most lethal wave of the virus. And as far as the positivity and mortality rates are concerned, They've been one of the highest in the country, that too, and several states have hugely underreported the figures of the pandemic. Now, there have been concerns raised by eminent personalities and office bearers of the government of India, including the chief principal scientific advisor to the Prime Minister, as to how perhaps the third wave or a new mutation of the virus may actually impact young people, and in fact even children. So that is also a concern that we have to account for when we go ahead, when we plan, the reopening of schools and education institutions as a government. There is tremendous responsibility that one has. While it is important to impart education, it is also important to protect the health of our children. So that is certainly weighing on the minds of the chief minister as well as the deputy chief minister as we plan the way forward.
One can completely understand that. Like I said, it's not an easy choice, and having seen what Delhi in particular went through the last couple of months, it has been quite a scare. Shreyasi Rao, are you there? Would you like to ask your question, Shreyasi Rao?
Yeah, I'm here.
Hi.
Thank you, Nidhi. So the question that I'd asked was, so I work as a Teach for India fellow in Bangalore, and one of the trends that we've been seeing is you have both in TFI intervention classes and those that are not, you have a lot of students who are enrolled in the school system. They'll be on the child tracking software that the government mandates all these schools to sort of use, but they won't be attending classes. Schools will push to make sure that enrollment happens because they're under fire if they don't have this enrollment that happens. But there is no push to ensure attendance happens, especially in low cost, like affordable private schools and in government schools. So what ends up happening is you have a lot of these kids who are working instead. And I was talking to one of my students who had been out of school and was choosing to work instead. And one thing he said was, I showed up to school actually 2 months ago and language classes were happening. And he's like, I didn't understand anything. And I decided it was just smarter to work, where I got 200 rupees a day working in a mechanic shop instead of coming to school. So you could, I think, on paper, have a lot of these kids who are technically out of school being shown as, not having dropped out. But I think there needs to be like so much effort made as to make sure to keep them in schools, like keep them in classrooms. And I'm not entirely sure how that has to happen on a larger scale, which is why I asked, what do you think could be feasible options to make sure that happens?
That's actually a great question. I want to first ask Prateek to take that, because Prateek, sort of related to this in a way, is also the question of girls' education. I mean, that's in any case, a big challenge in this country. But, is there any evidence to suggest that the education of girls in particular has got hit in this pandemic, that they are dropping out, in bigger numbers, and, it's going to be harder to bring them back as well?
First of all, I've also been a Teach for India fellow, so I can relate to what Shesi is saying. What I really want to emphasize at the start of the thing is that girls are disproportionately affected. It's not that children are not affected, but girls get affected disproportionately, right? When we started surveying, I've been to the field many times in a lot of the states. When we asked the girl is last one to eat in the family, right? And this was before pandemic, right? So if you look at now, if there's no food, I don't know what the girl is even eating, first of all, in terms of nutrition, right? So poverty, patriarchy, and policy were as it is not in favor of the girl before the pandemic. Right now, an additional P of pandemic has come to their lives, which has pushed them further to the margins, right? Let's understand what, right? Child marriage, right? We've made tremendous gain on ensuring that child marriage is reduced in India. You will see that picking up now, right? You will see child trafficking, especially girl trafficking, being on the high, right? You will see girls being more attuned to work. Shesi is talking about, boys being asked to work at 200. Now the girls will also be used as an asset to earn money, because let's look at today, the IMF has published data on how many people have regressed from middle class to lower middle class, from lower middle class to poverty, right? The poverty statistics in India are going to ensure that whatever gains we had made in the last 2 decades in terms of forget about retention and learning, right? Just the enrollment, we are not going to get those students back, right? Migration has hit them badly. People have gone from, my school where I taught in Bombay. Half the students have fled Ganesh Nagar and gone to UP, right? They aren't coming back because there is no livelihood left, right? So when I talk about, let's even look at the vaccine statistics, right? Girls and women are, not getting the same amount of vaccines and the men and the boys, right? So if this goes on, when the children are also going to get vaccine, girls are going to be the worst affected, right? So, the whatever gains we had made over the last few years in terms of ensuring that girls go to school, boys go to school, let alone retention and learning, those gains are also going to be undone, right? So our challenge is going to be first putting them in school, and then Shreshi's question of what to do with them. I think, there has to be incentives. I know of an intervention wherein the charging of the phone and the battery light was done in the school to ensure that the battery charges in 8 hours, so all the students also stay in school for 8 hours, because all these phones and lights need to be charged. Not everybody gets electricity in India, right? So we need to find creative ways, right? We need to incentivize non-monetary, monetary, to ensure that, if 200 rupees is what the parent needs, why can't we have a program wherein we've been talking about direct benefit transfers, right? If the kid attends school every day, they will get an X amount every month, right? If we have to do it, right, I know it pinches the exchequer, probably the petrol prices will go further, but this is the only way. If there is an incentive for the parent to send the child to a mechanic shop to get that 200, that parent desperately needs. By the way, tell me, if we're all, you're all parents, right? Right? Which parent would not want the best for their child, right? But getting 2 square meals is also best for the child, right? So what would you do, right? You would obviously go for the square meals. So we have to either incentivize monetarily or create non-monetary incentives, like, giving something which is linked to school, right? So that it forces them to stay within. So I think we have to totally look creatively out of the box. That's my solution.
There's another interesting question that's come here from Hidayah Academy, asking whether promoting class 12 students without the board exam was that a good decision? Can the government can conduct the exams later after a month or two when the situation would be under control? Yamini, Aiyar, I want to take that question to you because Prateek raised this point and he looked very unhappy that the board exams were cancelled. But I have to say that one has seen how banal and what an utter failure our education system, honestly, in my view, has been, when you look at the fact that kids with 98% are struggling to get into Delhi University, which is insane, and then crying that they didn't score 99. But that tells you, that in a nutshell sums up everything that's wrong with the system, but it is the only system we have known. Do you think, Yamini Aiyar, that this crisis might be an opportunity to break free from the shackles of the board exam? If that is the case, is there a way that students can be fairly assessed across the board throughout the school year in a way that's not so subjective? I mean, how do we do this? How do we do this that it's not about one exam?
You're asking the $1 million question, to which there isn't a good
this
enough
is for all
answer.
of you, if you have
Look,
ideas.
I think there's a lot that has been said about the board exams being cancelled. But just one additional point I want to make on that is that it reflects an important question, that when, as a society, what are the issues about schools that have made headlines over this last year and a half? Mostly examinations, not the issue of whether schools should be open or not. So a politician, and Raghav and the Delhi government are absolutely right. They're not going to risk opening schools if parents are not demanding it. And the parents whose demand gets heard the most are mostly elite parents who perhaps are not demanding it because we also do have the comfort of a particular social infrastructure that enables us to carry on with our lives. And so the inequities of whose voice is heard and what we as a society demand of our system and our politics are actually, to my mind, very, very visible. First thing. The second thing that the examination point highlights is how central the examination process is to how India thinks about its education system. I have spent a lot of time in classrooms and also studying what the Delhi government has been doing in its schools. And the one thing you always hear when you talk to teachers and when you talk to parents, the classroom is essentially a place where the curriculum has to be completed. That's the one metric on which, to the extent that government teachers are monitored, they are monitored on, and teachers have to maximize pass percentages. Parents too always look, bacha pass hua hai ya fail hua hai. The examination is a centerpiece around which we have shaped our classroom. We struggle with articulating what competencies we expect students to learn, especially in higher grades. But we are very clear as a society, and I've called this the classroom consensus, that parsing of the examination is the key metric on which to judge the school system. So as a society, we need to have a much broader dialogue about how to shift assessment in a way that captures learning competencies rather than the rote learning and the ability to maximize pass percentages or maximize that number. And we see those failures in this 98% issue that you've been speaking about. At the foundational level, at the elementary level, this conversation is, I think, to a degree much more mature. There has been a lot of talk about basic foundational learning levels. There's been a lot of experiments. And if you look at policy documents for education back from the 1990s, minimum learning levels used to be talked about in the 1990s. Now we are talking about foundational learning in the new education policy. We've said that by 2025, all students from standards 1 to 5 will have basic mathematical comprehension, reading skills. We have some clarity. We flounder a little bit at the higher levels, and no education system across the world has been able to figure out how you can get away from the high stakes exam story to be able to test and identify merit, and at the same time prepare those who do not make it effectively in that high stakes exam, prepare them for learning for life to be effective citizens and participants in the economy. And India is very, very far behind there. So that there's a much longer dialogue that needs to be had. The new education policy does give us a framework for that. What is important about this particular moment with them doing away of the board exams, it's challenging right now for teachers because the education system is not prepared, nor for, frankly, were the students. If you know that you're not going to, in Delhi, actually, when a small assessment was done in standard 6 to be able to check by the government and government schools, to be able to check what level of learning children were at and figure out how then the teaching should be reorganized. I was sitting in the staff room during a parent-teacher meeting, and parents came into the staff room shouting at the headmaster. Their issue was the following: if you're going to assess kids, exam ले रहे हो तो पहले तो बताना चाहिए था ना, बच्चा तैयार होके नहीं आया था, अब किस आधार पे उसका assessment ले रहे हो और decisions ले रहे हैं, marks कैसे दे रहे हो? So the system is designed to prepare to maximize near the exam. There has been no preparation in advance of that. If you don't gear up the system, then you do get in a stuck. That's the stuck that the class 12 students are facing now. The right to education for elementary schools 0 to 8 had experimented with CCE, complete comprehensive evaluation, which was meant to be this, taking you away from the exam system. We had a no detention policy. Students were to be assessed across a whole wide range of things, but we haven't geared up the classroom. We haven't prepared the parents. We haven't trained the teachers, and we haven't figured out how best to identify what those competencies are and articulate those effectively in the classroom. So it's a long haul, but there's an opportunity to start this conversation.
Absolutely, because I just want to ask Raghav before I come to Shaheen, Mistri on this particular issue, is that Raghav, we are already we're close to July now, and there is a real possibility that the March board exams of 2022 may also be hit if we're looking at potentially a third wave or a fourth wave, and multiple waves, as doctors are now saying. So are you all sort of already trying to push a conversation with the center that, look, please get your act together in advance and figure this out now, rather than calling off exams at the last minute? I mean, there has to be some other way to do this.
No, absolutely. I mean, I can't do crystal gazing and second guess what's going to happen in March 2022. But of course, we are deeply concerned about the point that you highlighted. In fact, Manish Sisodia ji had also spoken on this particular issue at the meeting conducted by the Union Education Minister a few weeks ago in order to decide the fate of those who are in 12th standard and whether to conduct the board examination or not. And we are deeply concerned about this. Just to supplement what Yamini has said, I do completely agree with her that the examination system or the school system in this country is such where the measure of one's ability or one's learning is only written examination of a predetermined syllabus at a predetermined time and date and in a predetermined manner. The Arvind Kejriwal government in Delhi has actually tried to, really change the way we look at assessing the ability and the knowledge of a particular student and the ability of a student. Now, the Delhi government is coming out with its own education board. Now, that particular board will certainly employ modern technology, leverage technology in a big way. It will also ensure personalized learning experience for the students. And as far as assessment is concerned, artificial intelligence tools will be used, and games based assessment, not just written examination of a predetermined syllabus, but game based assessments will also be leveraged in a big way. The government of Delhi has laid a lot of thrust on the happiness index or the happiness quotient of students, and we've also started the happiness curriculum, which all of you are already aware of. So we're actually working on the social well-being of the student and strengthening their foundation, rather than just pushing them and forcing them to mug up the syllabus books and essentially sit for a long, lengthy 4-hour examination in which you just have to fill sheets in order to secure good percentage.
No, I come to this percentage point, Shaheen, Mistri, because
I scored pretty well
on TV where kids with 95% started crying, and
Nidhi, I got 92% in my 12th examination somehow, though I wasn't that meritorious a student back in the day, and I couldn't get the college of my choice or the course of my choice, so I also had to compromise. So I passed my board exams roughly 1.5 decades ago. So it's pretty bad. I do empathize and sympathize with the students.
So Shaheen, Mistri, again, I come to that the $1 million question, as Yamini Aiyar says. What is the fairest way to assess students? Is there a fair way? As Yamini rightly pointed out, most countries haven't really been able to get past that sort of examination system in higher education, but is there any other way to do it? Or is there a way, even if you have exams and you do, should there be multiple exams? Should it be like an SAT kind of system? What can it be?
Yeah, there's a thought even above that to me, which is like, what has the purpose of education become? And I think unless we redefine that, it's very tough to redefine how we measure. If we expand and broaden the purpose of education and say, yes, getting into college to get a livelihood is one important part of an education, but the way that we uplift those around us, the way that we contribute to the country, these are all important dimensions of the purpose of education. So one, I think we need to start having a dialogue, and this is an unprecedented time to be able to do that on what education actually is for. And then the second is, I think we need to shift our paradigm from exams being about achievement and really actually school being about achievement to schools being about learning, right? And I think when we shift that, that's a very important shift, because I don't go to school to be better than somebody else. I go to school to make sure that I'm a little bit ahead of where I was last week, right? And so when you look at assessment in that way, and you're assessing a broader canvas of things because your purpose of education is broadened, then I feel learning assessment has to be continuous. And so just want to really agree with a lot of the points that Yamini made. I think we had the concept right with continuous evaluation. I just don't think we put in the effort to think through the implementation and the many changes, mindset and technical, that would be needed to make that happen. And the last point I'll make is that everything we talk about as if it's something futuristic has been tried somewhere in the world, right? There are schools that have done this. They know how to do this. They know how to evaluate kids continuously. They know how to not make kids feel small and cry when they get 92 or 94%. We have to just learn from them, and we have to be committed to taking the steps to change all of this.
Okay, Shubhajit Ghosh has a question. That's the last question we'll take from the audience who's joined in. Shubhajit, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you. So there's a lot of incredible open source content for education across all levels available online in a lot of languages. And with the pandemic, a lot of online learning has sort of become the norm. But what we sort of see is we see a lot of these edtech companies stealing the show, right? And it's only accessible to people with a lot of privilege and a lot of money. So what do you think is the future for low-cost online schools only for people at the bottom of the pyramid? Thank you.
Prateek, would you like to take that? Prateek? Yeah. Prateek, would you like to take that or
the voice is breaking, please. Hello.
Okay. Yamini or Shaheen, if anyone of you would like to, take that question.
Hello.
If there's, yeah.
Yamini, go ahead. I'll just have say something quickly, and Yamini, please add on. But I just think if we have like political will to provide access, I think that in the future of education, the tab is going to be as important as the textbook, right? And if you don't have access to the tab and you don't have access to technology, you're just going to be left behind. So with the same caution that Yamini used around board exams, I think we need to enter into blended learning, digital learning slowly, thoughtfully, really think through the many different things that need to be thought through. But I think it'll need tremendous political will. Is it possible? Do we have the resources for it? I think yes, we do. The question is like, do we have the will and commitment to see it through for every single child?
Yamini, do you want to add to that? Okay, just a quick last question before we go. And this is actually, I wish we'd gotten to this earlier, which is about the mental health of children, parents, teachers. And Shaheen, I'll take that question to you first. The fact that children don't have that physical contact with their classmates and their teachers, what is the impact that you're already seeing, on them? I mean, I see my 6-year-old niece with in a big Zoom class and, sitting for hours in front of the screen, and there's just just zero physical contact. I feel terrible seeing, how she's learning right now. But how are kids coping with that? What is the impact of that on them?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if anyone on the call can answer differently, but I haven't met a single child that I've asked in the last 15 months that hasn't cited really not wanting to stay at home and learn and be isolated. And I think the research is showing very frightening things in just looking at the number of calls that Childline has received, doubled this year. Number of kids in poverty doubled this year. The number of kids expressing mental health and going to counselors has dramatically increased. And so I think it's just a very, very big issue. Like, kids don't go to school just to learn math and language. They go to school because socialization, physical activity, like these are just very, very, very important aspects of growing up. And in the absence of that, I think it's had very severe repercussions on our children.
Yamini, on this question?
Absolutely. I think Shaheen has sort of talked about the impact on children, and we are seeing it personally. We are seeing it through the research. There's no question. But I also would like to say that I suspect that there's also been a huge mental toll that has been paid by teachers as well, and especially government teachers. They are not my most favorite people. Absenteeism rates in government schools is extremely high. The quality of teaching leaves a lot to be desired. However, they are our frontline workers and they have been deployed to do a lot of things. The mental toll this must be taking on them, and now the pressure on them once schools start reopening to deal with the classroom is going to be immense. So we have to think through this very carefully, which also means that we have to think very carefully about how we open schools. The reopening of the schools is going to be a moment of celebration, of joy, of children coming back, of them finding themselves all over again. I certainly have noticed with my children, they've forgotten how to socialize, or maybe they've just become really naughty, but some combination of both. But a reintegration, and we can't think of this classroom as an age grade structure anymore, because in normal times, the reality of India's classrooms are such that you have kids at standard 2 level, at standard 8 level, and standard 5 level, all sitting in the same classroom. With having been out of school for so long, the Azim Premji University University study has also pointed out children have lost language, children have lost basic math skills. They will be at very different levels depending on the kind of input they receive, their adaptability, etc. We have to think of the classroom as a flexible place, as a space of learning, as a place where different kinds of children at different levels can come together with a very deep interaction with the teacher. We have to bring the teacher back into the front and center of the classroom, and we have to actively think of the classroom as a place that is not about completing curriculum and maximizing pass percentages, but as a place of genuine interaction and learning. And that will be the first step to this larger school reform that so many of us have been talking about and working on for so long.
Well, there's a lot to think about from everything that all of you have said this evening. I'd like to thank you all so much for coming and having this conversation. It is an important conversation to have. Let people go back and think about these issues. I think when you're talking about bigger reforms, which all of you have spoken about, until parents and teachers and the whole system sort of reorients the way we think about learning and what education actually is, that change is not going to happen. Raghav, Chadha, I sincerely hope you guys are able to open Delhi schools sooner rather than later, but safely. I understand the dilemmas that you have. It's not an easy time, but thank you once again to all of you for joining us.